Thank you very much indeed. My first slide has the caveat because, first of all, I'm only covering the 19th century, well, tail end of the 18th and the 19th. And secondly, I am principally looking at the northeastern end of the bay, which on that aerial shot you can see to the right-hand side of Dundrum Bar, and you can see the rocks, they're the dark shadows. But that is where my research to date has taken me. I hope to do the rest of the bay in due course, but at the moment this is going to be based on that area. The southern half of the bay, and I'm only counting the bay running from Annalone, which is in line with the fisheries, the Irish fisheries, when they were doing the bylaws against trawlers. It ran from first Kilkeel and then shortened to Annalone to St John's Point. But you can see there quite clearly the sandy beaches that run from the Dundrum Inner Bay to just about Newcastle, about the harbour, and thereafter you have the stony shoreline. Now that is in contrast to this, and this is only partial. These are some of the rocks. This is taken from Ringsallen Point, where the Coastguard station is. These are only some of the rocks that stretch out into the bay. Some of them stretch out over a mile out into the bay. And behind us, which I don't have a drone shot for, are the rocks of Rathmullen Point, Ringmore Point, and then the very rocky coastline that runs round Rossglass and up to St John's Point. So when you compare the two slides, or the two views, the southern half of the bay is largely sandy, and when ships grounded, if they were lucky enough to ground at a full tide, they were usually able to get off. So although quite a few ships grounded, not as many ships were wrecked in the southern half so far that I can see. But in the northeastern half of the bay, that is where most of the wrecks, the strandings, and then, as I'll explain later, what happens whenever a ship strands depends very much on what stage the tide is, as to whether it survives or doesn't. Now this is a quote, I hope you can read it. It's from Walter Harris in 1744. And that's an excerpt of Walter Harris's map when he did the ancient history of the county of Down. And the map itself is very interesting because it shows Tyrella with the old spelling of T-E-R-E-L-A, Rathmullen, Ballyveston, Clonmacnoise, Rathmullen Point, St John's Point with the windmill, and then over to Newcastle, Ballykinler, Clough, Dundrum, and Panther. And the area we're looking at is the area from basically where it says Ballykinler round to St John's Point. Now what Walter Harris was talking about is the confluence of the north tide and the south tide. And in the Irish Sea you have the North Channel, that's the Atlantic Ocean coming in and coming down the very narrow straits between Scotland and the Arch Peninsula, which is the North Channel. And then coming up from the Irish Sea, you have, of course, St George's Channel coming into the Irish Sea. And the two tides meet about 5 miles off St John's Point. And what that results in is basically dead water landward. So the bay of Dundrum is basically dead water. It doesn't have a current. So the point that Walter Harris is making, and it is made in endless reports thereafter, is that because, of course, the ships in those days were sailing ships, if a ship gets blown into Dundrum Bay, then basically it's stuffed. It can't get back out. If there's a southerly, an easterly, or a southeasterly wind, it can't get out because it's being blown into the shore. There is no current to help it get back out. And that's what the phrase embayed means. And quite often, again, because ships of course did not have modern navigational tools, quite often the ships were sailing close enough to land, and a gale gets them, there are endless newspaper reports of ships putting in to Carlingford Lough or to Ardglass and waiting for a gale to go by, rather than try passing that short space between St John's Point and along Kilkee, because it was so known to be dangerous. There are just so many reports of ships that just don't take that on. And that's the reason Walter Harris's quote in 1744 is just, I just like it as a quote, but it is basically the explanation for why ships were in bay. The three pictures on the left, I don't know why the machine chose to put them in that order, I don't know. The middle one should be the first one, the top one should be the second one, and the bottom is the third one. They're all taken from exactly the same vantage point. The rocks are clearly visible in the first one. At half tide, you can barely see them. And in a full tide, there is the moorings, you just don't see them because of the fog. Full tide, they're just not visible at all. So, again, maritime maps were not terribly good. They didn't mark on. The only one that was marked on, usually, was the Cow and the Calf. The rocks surrounding it, the platies, were never usually marked on, and the other rocks, never. On the occasion you would get perhaps a very detailed map, you might get what we call Sea Rock and Bird Rock, which are Stinker Rock and Smith's Rock. They might be marked on, and Craigellea, but that would be it. So a ship doesn't necessarily know that those rocks are there, and if they are blown in and the ship hits them, then again, they've had it. Wooden ships don't stand much chance against the ragged rocks. However, if they were fortunate enough to miss the rocks, like the SS Great Britain was, and they get stranded on the beach, it then depends where the tide is. If the tide is fully in, then the ship is usually fairly safe. Mind you, it took the SS Great Britain 11 months to get off, but she was a massive iron boat, and therefore, or ship, steamship, and therefore, of course, she was well sunk into the sand. But most ships, a lot of the newspaper reports will say grounded, got off, or grounded, towed off. And that's fine because they got in at high tide, and unless it's very, very rough, they're likely to get off in the next day or two. However, on a half tide, or even worse, on an ebb tide, a ship has pretty much, again, had it. When the tide turns, then the breakers come in, and the breakers just literally wreck the ship. And there are plenty of news reports, again, of crews who didn't understand that this is what was going to happen, and who stayed on the ship. And then, of course, when the tide comes, they have to be rescued, and or they simply don't make it. And the ship breaks up. One of the fastest ships that broke up was on the Rossglass, the beach between Ballybest and Rossglass, the Emily. And the Emily was stranded at low tide, just as the tide was turning. And the crew were seen from the shore, trying, this 36, I think, they were trying very hard to get the sails down, the masts down, so that they could get ready for going out. And the tide turned, and the ship was broken up within 15 minutes, and not a body of the crew was found. So it can really be quite as dramatic as that. The dangers of the bay, particularly in a gale. Right, the occurrence of shipwrecks, and again, this doesn't say it, but we are talking about the northeastern end of the bay. 220 ships lost from 1747 to 1897. Only 2 did not have a month reported, so therefore we're accounting for the others. You can see that, almost 2/3 of the ships were wrecked from November to February. March to May, 16, June to August, you would think, surely summer months, but 10%, and September, October, 15. The worst single month, of course, was January. So of the 220 ships lost, a quarter of them basically lost in the month of January over that period of time. However, the increase in shipping losses is also quite noticeable. In the period, and it's, I thought I'd proofread this, but obviously I haven't, because we have 11,810 grand. 13 ships. Now, of course, there are far more ships than are recorded. The recordings I've got from Lloyd's Lists, from local newspapers, and from British Newspaper Archive, which is a very, very good place if anybody's looking. It's online, you pay a membership fee, but it's incredible the number of newspapers you can consult. But you can see the pattern goes up to 1840 and then it drops off. Now I think the drop off between 1840 and 1870 I think is probably due to the lighthouse at St John's Point. Because the lighthouse was built, permission was given in 1839 and it was opened in 1845, at least it first on its beam in the May of 45. And I think that accounts for a fair number of the decrease in the shipping losses, because then there's a light, and that is sort of a very important warning. It should be said, however, that the light was only lit at dusk, from dusk to dawn. So if you have a particularly muggy day or a big fog or something like that, there was no foghorn, and there was no 24/7 beam. So the ships that were wrecked were largely those that were wrecked in a very murky storm where the light wasn't on. But the drop-off from about 1870 onwards is more to do with the increasing use of steamships rather than anything else. Okay, why were there so many ships? And basically it is, of course, to do with the Industrial Revolution. You can see Dundrum Bay fairly clearly there, opposite the southern tip of the Isle of Man. And the small ports from Killaloch, Portferry, Newry, Ballywalter, Carrick, and of course the southern ports, they're all trading with the equally small ports of Sylph, Beaumaris, Maryport, Ayr and Troon. And the sorts of things that are going backwards and forwards that you see in the newspaper reports are slates, coal, fish, cattle, manure, and on one occasion brimstone, which is sulphur. And those are that's the coastal trade, and those were the small ships. The little sloops, the schooners, the small schooners, not the big ones, and the little ketches, they were between 20 to 60 tons registered. So they were small, and if they got stuck in the bay, they really had virtually no chance. However, the foreign trade expands, of course, phenomenally through the 19th century because of the Industrial Revolution. Liverpool at the heart of it, of course, the biggest manufacturing areas being in the hinterland of Liverpool. And to Liverpool come the raw materials from literally the colonies and everywhere else, so from every corner of the globe. And then the finished products were then shipped out from Liverpool as well. Dublin has an increase in trade, Belfast expands exponentially, as does Glasgow. And the main shipping trade is up the Irish Sea to the west of the Isle of Man, and that's because of the depth of seawater. Between the Isle of Man and the Cumbrian coast, the water is on average about 20 fathoms. Between the Isle of Man and Dundrum Bay, it is between 76 and 90 fathoms. So of course the bigger ships will take the westward route. The bigger ships are, of course, the ships that you fully expect, like the SS Great Britain, to have no problem. But even the bigger ships had tiller problem, rudder problem, and could get blown into the bay. They are the ships that tended to survive because they could drop anchor. And if they got into the lee of St John's Point, they could usually survive with a bit of assistance in dropping anchor and wait for the storm to ride out. The little ships had very little chance. Shipwreck, of course, is a very costly business, both in terms of capital costs and human costs. Now, I have not done, I'm sure it's probably done somewhere, but all I have done is take a piece out of the Newry Telegraph. There was a great campaign from 37 to 39 by the Newry Telegraph and the Downpatrick Recorder in order to get a lighthouse in St John's Point. And quite rightly they decided that the thing to appeal to the corporation for the improvement of the Port of Dublin, which later becomes the Ballast Board, and later after that the Irish Lights, they decided that the best way to appeal to them was on capital costs. So the Newry Telegraph published this list of ships, the 16 ships, which were wrecked, well, far more than that, 16 ships from the northeastern end of the bay, and estimated their value at 50,000. So in the space of 6 years, that, in today's money, is between 6 and 10 million. And that's 6 ships. Cargoes and ships lost. It was quite commonplace for shipwreck auctions to be held on the site. So nearly all of the newspapers carried advertisements. Wreck of the British Heroine, 1839, where she lies on Rathmullen Beach, or the Amelie Louise, where she lies in Newcastle Beach. And you came and literally there was nothing that wasn't for sale. Copper boats, mainstays, ropes, chains, the hull, whatever could be sold was sold, because that then recouped some of the money for the underwriters. The bigger cost, of course, in a sense, is the cost of human lives, but interestingly, in the early days of the newspaper reports, there's no mention of the crew whatsoever. None. The crew would, the report would indicate the name of the ship, its master, its route, its cargo, and what happened to it. Whether the crew survived or didn't survive never appeared in any of the early newspaper reports. By 1810, some reports were beginning to say, crew survived, crew perished, but no mention of how many. And it takes well into the 1820s, 1830s, before the crew become of interest to the newspaper reports. And then thereafter, the cargo is the less important, the fate of the crew becomes the more important. And some of the stories become increasingly not lurid, but like boys' own stories of what happened, and the heroism and the rest of it. Of the 220 ships wrecked in our part of the bay, only 55 of the newspaper reports actually mentioned how many crew. So that's a quarter. And I'm not suggesting you necessarily then, do your sums and work out how many, if that's only a quarter, how many were totally lost. But 259 were recorded as dead, or lost, perished, and 236 were saved. So if you times that by another 3 or 4, I think you're probably closer to where you are. 130 of that 236 were saved by the Tyrella lifeboats from 1838 to 1899. So that the shipwreck carried its costs. The fishermen were, of course, the main rescuers up until the more formal lifeboat and coastguard came into existence. And the etching that's there, that's a fishing boat. Maybe rowed by 2, 3, 4 people at most. And they're putting out into seas that are astronomical. More often, actually, it's the surf that causes the problem, in order to try and rescue people. 2 Clonmacnoise fishermen, they were in their own boat when it capsized with 5 of the crew of the Coeur de Lion, and the 2 Clonmacnoise fishermen died. In 1862, the Bellona, which had tried to get into Dundrum Bar and couldn't, and had got wrecked on the sands, but quite far out, so the water was beating over. The crew, the ship had hit at night, nobody saw them, so it was only in the morning that they were seen. And Felix Redmond and his 2 brothers, who were fishermen out of Dundrum, got into their boat and tried to get to the ship to rescue the master, and their boat just totally turned turtle. And they were very fortunate to survive. They were picked up by the Marquis of Downshire's agent, James Cunningham, in one of the Marquis's boats, but they couldn't get to the Bellona. So it took the Newcastle lifeboat went out, the Tyrella lifeboat went out, the Tyrella lifeboat got there first, but they managed to save the master. But the fishermen went out irrespective. Now, the Coastguards were formed in Ireland somewhere around about the 1819, 1820, 21 period, and they were known as the Preventative Water Guard. And the first job was the top picture, to stop the smuggling. There was a huge amount of smuggling, mostly from the Isle of Man, but also from Flushing in Holland. And it was mostly tobacco and tea and rum, but mostly tobacco for some reason. They were so incredibly successful that they became coastguards within about 5 or 6 years. They were run really almost separately to the English coastguards, run by James Dunbrain until 1855, and Dunbrain was very in favour of lifeboats and involved himself with placing lifeboats in about 4 or 5 places around Ireland. But when James Dunbrain retired, the Admiralty then took over, and they became a naval force, a reserve naval force. Some of them were called up for the Crimea, but the Irish coastguards were returned fairly quickly because of the fear of a rebellion in Ireland while the cat's away, the mice will play. So they were returned pretty quickly to their stations. The earliest picture that sketch that I could find is the middle one, and the bottom one where they are much more in naval uniform with their guns, but they had always been a military force. They had always had their guns and their muskets in order to fight off the smugglers if necessary. They did have their own boat or galley. They were frequently responsible for rescuing shipwreck crews, but they're more important, and particularly for us in the northeastern part of Dundrum Bay, they were the eyes and ears of the lifeboat. They summoned the lifeboat when they saw a ship in distress, and that was the main way in which they operated together. They were also the crew. The Tyrella Coastguard station, which is on Ringsalem Point, initially was just the white watch house. It was built in 1821, and its remit, or the remit of the coastguards, changed once they were no longer stopping the smuggling. They were guarding against looting of ships and cargo, and they had the additional remit in 1829 of saving lives where possible. The first Tyrella lifeboat was stationed there, and in the 1840s, 3 of the Tyrella Coastguards won RNLI silver medals for their courage at rescue. From 1860 to 1899, the Coastguards were an integral part of the Tyrella lifeboat crew. The terrace of crew housing, you can see, they weren't built until the 1860s. Now, this might be a little more difficult to read. What I was trying to do is to show there were in fact 4 lifeboats in Dundrum Bay in the 19th century. The first lifeboat arrived in 1825, and for those of you who were here when Robert was talking, it was certainly the first one in the north of Ireland. Whether it was the first one in Ireland, I absolutely concur. That's not yet. I think it is too, but that's not absolutely proven. The lifeboat is moved in 1832, 1833 to St John's Point, and in 1842 it's declared unfit. A lifeboat arrives at Tyrella in 1838. I'm going to say a little bit more about it. In Newcastle, a lifeboat arrives in 1830, and at the end of 1832 it's sent to Skerries. Now, those three things, the reason I want to talk about that is because they are just symptomatic of what was wrong with the early RNLI. It had been formed with the most amazing of intentions, the most wonderful of principles, which still stand today, but with a bunch of very well-meaning people who had heaps of money and really didn't know what to do with it. So they gave it out to medals, to monetary rewards, and they didn't seem to do very much in the way of checking on lifeboats, or checking that the lifeboat was actually doing what it was supposed to, or keeping an eye on what was happening. Once a lifeboat left them, pretty much that was it. And the Newcastle boat is a wonderful example. The Newcastle boat, which arrived in 1830, had already been to Arklow. And it had sat in Arklow for 2 years, and nobody was using it. So they shipped it up to Newcastle in County Down. And it sat for another 2 and a bit years, nobody used it. So it was shipped to the Skerries, where it sat for another 2 or 3 years, and it was eventually shipped to Rosslare. And then it was condemned, because it wasn't seaworthy. The first lifeboat arrived in 1825. It was an 18-foot plenty, and for its day quite amazing. But in 1832, after Ogilvy had died, Captain Brown of Janeville decided to move it to St John's Point. He didn't ask for permission, and the RNLI never questioned it. So it just moved. When the first lifeboat arrived to Tyrella, it had come from Howth. And James Dunbrain had it sent up, and he then sent a minute, or a letter, which is minuted in the RNLI archives, saying that James Dunbrain has sent a lifeboat up to Tyrella, where most wrecks occur, and he would like the RNLI to pay for it. And they did. They never asked after that where it was, what it was doing, where it was housed, anything else. The last report of the lifeboat was 1852. Now, in 1850, the whole RNLI was completely reorganised, and under the new organisation, they used the money that they had from a very handsome legacy to build as many lifeboat stations as they could. And Newcastle was the first established in 1856, followed by Grimsport shortly after. But almost as soon as it was established, they realised that they couldn't patrol the whole of the bay, and they started looking for somewhere in the north part of the bay to put a lifeboat station. And it was a toss-up between whether they go back to Rossglass or to Tyrella, and eventually they decided on Tyrella. So from 1860 to 1899, Tyrella is a fully functioning RNLI branch station with 4 boats. The Newcastle station is, of course, still running. The Marianne followed the Farnley, but since we're talking about this, it is still the only established station. When Tyrella closed down, and it closed down on paper because they couldn't find enough fishermen to man the boats, and the Coastguard station was under notice, they opened a new station in Kellogg. They couldn't get permission to build the boathouse, and it tittled on for a while. On paper it opens in 1901, the boat doesn't arrive till 1904. It goes out 3 times, saves nobody. Now that's not an indictment, it's just by that stage there wasn't the same need for a lifeboat, and in 1914 the station was closed. So that's an overview, but we're only looking at the Tyrella lifeboats. This is a picture that appeared in an RNLI tweet in 2014, and I got so excited, it was unbelievable, and rushed up to Lynn and went, look, we've got a picture of our boathouse, but it's not. It's Court Town, but it just looked so like ours that I thought, oh, wonderful. But this is taken in 1861 of Court Town in the South Band. It is what a boat would have looked like. On its carriage, with the crew on board, the large oar for steering, and the crew with their oars sitting up, and the lifeboat house as well. And that's what the early lifeboats would have looked like. However, the very first lifeboat at Tyrella came in 1838. It was entirely manned by the Tyrella Coastguards. It was kept in an outside store, that's the only information that we have. And we know it went out 2 weeks after its arrival, and it's case number 674, which you can just see underneath there. Tyrella Dundrum Bay, ship British heroine. It took them 3 goes to bring off the entire crew. And in its period of time, the newspaper reports have it saving 5 others, and only 1 ship they actually gave the number of crew. So the first Tyrella lifeboat exists. We know very little about it, but it is down as having saved, now RNLI figures have it as saving 6, but in the RNLI's own account it saved 26, so we have a slight discrepancy. The RNLI Tyrella station was established in 1860, and this is my proudest possession because it is the only photograph that we know of the boat. RNLI archives, whenever it was first found, puts it as either the first or the second Tyrella boat, either 1860 or 1866, one or other of the 2 vintages. The boat itself is what's known as a self-righting boat, which means that when it capsizes, it instantly turns over, the ballasting and the rest of it, and it's got a very ingenious sort of device for ejecting water. So it's obviously much safer to be in a lifeboat than it is to be in an ordinary open boat. This, I was going to say this is the Tyrella, but it has since been re-roofed with nice, shiny, corrugated roofing, but never mind. That is what there is of the Tyrella lifeboat house. I do remember it before all that plasterwork and the window was put in, but they were of a pattern, and basically almost every lifeboat house followed the same pattern. Okay, the first boat was called the Tyrella, was launched 8 times and saved 6 lives. 4 of its rescues, it went out, including one where it was literally out all night at sea, and one where it was out but on the beach all night in a fierce gale. It was known as the Tyrella. We don't know that it was Lady Matilda Montgomery. We think it was her. It was mentioned in one newspaper report, but in everything else she is just called a friend or a lady. And that was the way in which the RNLI was trying to recoup its money by getting people to sponsor lifeboats. So the 3rd Newcastle boat, but the first sort of proper self-righting boat, was called the Reigate because it was sponsored by the people of the town of Reigate. The second Tyrella lifeboat was launched 11 times, and these are all RNLI statistics. It saved 38, and there are 2 ships that it saved crew, but we don't have a number recorded. Its biggest rescue was from the Norwegian ship Neptunus, which was stranded in Ringsalon Point, and the seamanship of the acting cox John Williams, but he was the chief boatman of Tyrella Coastguards, and this is literally his doorstep. So he obviously knew exactly where he was going, but nonetheless they have to get the boat from the boathouse to Ringsalon Point. Right? It took them an hour and a half just to row what would take 15 minutes to walk. In 1874, the Donna Maria rescue earned 2 silver awards for the cocks and the assistant cocks, and this is the rescue. It was of the Donna Maria, and the inset is the silver medal, the reverse side of the silver medal. I think it says, "Lest not the deep swallow you up." It was carrying timber for Holland and Wolf and wrecked in the rocks of Ballyveston. Lifeboats had to be horsed because it was, and the next slide will explain that, as to why. But 5 of the 6 crew were rescued. As one of the crew, which the newspaper very politically incorrectly said the darkie, the black man, fell into the water leaving the ship. Now that in those days, that could have been the end of him, because if he got crushed between the lifeboat and the ship, there wouldn't have been a lot left. But they got him on board, but the 6th man was trapped because the logs had rolled and his leg was pinned. So the lifeboat went ashore, it returned with saws, the assistant cox was tied to the side of the ship, and it took them 3 hours to saw through the bulwarks in order to get wedges so that they could get the logs out to get the man in. The 2 injured men were taken to Dundrum Infirmary. And one of the reasons that I'm, it's an amazing rescue, but so fond of that as a rescue, is that there was a spat of letters in the Downpatrick Recorder, which went on for 3 weeks, because the Downpatrick Recorder came out on a Saturday. The coroner, one William Davidson, had seen the report of this, and he wrote a stinging letter the following week saying how unchristian it was of them to have left the poor man to suffer. They should have stayed on the ship and got him off there and then. But to make matters worse, he then went to visit the 2 injured men, who told him exactly what happened, and he wrote all that down. And he still finished by saying how unchristian this was. And the next week then there were letters from 2 of the people associated with the rescue saying basically, don't know what you're talking about, this is what happened. And what I like about it is it's so detailed, and it really does fill in a picture as to what exactly was involved in the rescue. Horses were extremely important to lifeboats. The Tyrella lifeboat got its horses from Tyrella House, which was a matter of a couple of 100 yards from where the lifeboat station was. But the carriage you can see in the picture, it took 4 to 6 horses to pull it. They were, of course, working horses, they were great big cart horses. But the lifeboat weighed about 3 tons, and then you add another ton for the carriage. And you had launchers, up to 18 to 20 launchers, whose job was to help get the lifeboat into the sea, because it was done in such a way that the crew were on the boat, it went into the sea, went off from the carriage, and then the launchers brought the carriage back in. It was much more time efficient to horse the lifeboat to where you were going, even though country lanes might have been bumpy, muddy, and basically incredibly difficult to get over. But that was better and much more time efficient than for the men to try to row that distance. There was actually a law passed by the government which made it mandatory for farmers to provide horses if they were required. But the RNLI paid every time the horses were used, and they paid compensation. The Memorial was the 3rd of the boats at Tyrella. It was the most successful in the sense that it rescued 60. Its most famous rescue was 1886, when it rescued the 5 crew and 2 children from the Barclay. And the Barclay was basically wedged between Bird Rock and Seal Rock, or Smith's Rock and Stinker Rock, which is, you could walk from the boathouse, 5 minutes would take you there. It took them an hour rowing to get it. It took them 3 goes to get off the beach. In the end, they had to get off double banked. That is, each of the oars had 2 men on them, because the surf and the waves were just so high, they couldn't get off. The phrase which is sort of the two phrases which are important here. The night was pitchy dark, and had it not been for the manner in which the vessel's crew. The most important thing about that is that the crew of the vessel had taken all their spare clothes, doused them in petroleum, paraffin, and set them alight. So it acted like a beacon or a brazier so that the crew could see where they were going, because it was absolutely pitch dark. There are no lights. There's no Coast Guard helicopter with a spotlight overhead trying to find where people were. So without that, they wouldn't have been found. It would have taken a lot longer, and of course you can't hear the cries for help. The Victoria, however, was not so lucky. And on paper, it's the one that should have been saved. It struck the rocks at Rathmullen, and that is within easy visibility of the Coast Guard station. But they couldn't be seen because it was a filthy night, it was dark. So it wasn't until the morning that the ship was seen. And they could see the crew, everybody could see the crew, because anybody on the Clonmacnoise shore, Rathmullen shore, was out on the beach. The Coast Guards crawled out as far along the Rathmullen point as they could go, but the wind was so strong that the lifelines kept coming back. The lifeboat was horsed to the spot. People could see folk literally dropping with exhaustion off the rigging. And the irony is that just as the lifeboat was launched and on its way, the top spar gave way and the rigging collapsed and the men went with them. The bodies were never found. They were just literally swept away. The reports up to about 2-3 weeks later indicated those bodies had never turned up. The fourth and final ship was the Louisa Burnaby. It saved 7, 5 of them off a steamship called the Wild Rose. It was the one which had probably almost the most interesting one in terms of litigation. The coxswain had to go to Downpatrick Assizes to reclaim money of the owner of a ship called the Fly, because the Fly was having difficulty getting into Dundrum Bay and it asked for a pilot. So the Tyrella Lifeboat, having ascertained that there was nothing they could do to get them on board, the Tyrella Lifeboat went off, got a pilot, and then brought the pilot back to the Fly. And under our NLI rules, you could do that. But the owner of the Fly would have to pay the time for the men in the lifeboat. And of course he didn't. He refused point blank. So the coxswain had to go to court in order, and got the cost awarded, in order to get the money to pay. Because RNLI wouldn't pay because they weren't out saving lives. They were out doing a service. The age of steam is where we finish with, because Dundrum Bay is a danger to sailing ships, still is a danger to sailing ships. Doesn't go away just because we're in the 21st century, but obviously not a danger as such to a steamship unless it becomes disabled or crippled, such as the Wild Rose. It shipped too much water and its fires went out, and then it was just as like a sailing ship would be. The bay is therefore no longer a graveyard. So steamers largely took over from sailing ships, and therefore, accordingly, we had less wrecks. 1899, when the site was closed down, now it has to be said the writing was on the wall for quite some time for Tyrella. There had been a massive shift of population. There had been huge emigration from the 1870s of fishermen, and the lifeboat was actually crewed by farm labourers and coastguards. There wasn't one fisherman on the Louisa Burnaby, not one, because there basically weren't any left on that stretch of the coast. The Tyrella was closed down in 1899. The Coast Guard station was closed down literally just 10 years after. We know it's there in 1909, and we know it's not there in 1911. So it's somewhere between those two dates, and I haven't nailed down which of the the exact time that it went. But the Coastguards, the Admiralty, had given notice, and Coastguard stations were being closed all over Ireland and all over England. And Tyrella lasted rather more surprisingly long than I would have expected. This is the final one. This is the quote that to me sums up, because the RNIs, of course, was then and is now volunteers. And the letter of William Davison to the downcaptured reporter, to me, is just a summary of a sort of a very officious person who thought he knew better and had no understanding of how a lifeboat worked, no understanding of the dangers involved, no understanding of the courage involved, and I think that quote from Sir George Sartorius sums all of that up. So that's me.